Now, from CBS 4 News, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Good morning, I'm Jim DeFede, and welcome to Facing South Florida. Now, one of the things I like about the format of this show is that it gives me an opportunity to take a closer look at issues in the news. For the past few months, we've been exploring working conditions at Miami International Airport in an ongoing series we call MIA's Forgotten Workers. We've reported on cabin cleaners, wheelchair operators, and workers inside the airport's restaurants. But later in the show, we'll look at the 1,200 workers who load the planes with food and snacks and beverages. I think you'll be surprised by what we found. But first, a story that almost seems too bizarre to be real. It starts with the owner of the New England Patriots visiting the Orchids of Asia Day Spa in Jupiter. Robert Kraft allegedly went looking for something, well, off the menu, something illicit, and was subsequently arrested. That case has fallen apart, but it led us on a journey to the former owner of the day spa, Cindy Yang, and that's when the story took a turn that landed inside Mar-a-Lago. Turns out Cindy Yang was a major Republican donor who is now at the center of an ever-growing investigation into possible campaign finance violations, influence peddling, and even potentially espionage. Most of this information has been uncovered by the Miami Herald, and two of the reporters who have been doing a phenomenal job are with us this morning. Sarah Blasky started digging into the story from its earliest days. She has been with the Herald for a little more than a year, and Jay Weaver is a long time, very old and senior federal courts reporter for the paper, who I know well and used to work with. Welcome to both of you. You don't mind I call you old and senior?
No, it's okay.
All right. All right, so let's start with this story. So last February, Robert Kraft, the police announced this major arrest against a number of individuals, and Robert Kraft is one of them, billionaire owner of the Patriots. The media goes nuts with the sensationalism of a billionaire going to a little place in Jupiter, you know, and the prosecutors run wild with the story about how this is part of an international sex trafficking ring. But what really was lying underneath the story was something that you found, Sarah. You started digging a little bit deeper into it, and it really wasn't the sex trafficking or the prurient interests of the owner of the New England Patriots, but it was the former owner of the day spa. Talk to me about how you stumbled on Cindy Yang.
Sure. So in the process of trying to learn more about this spa where Robert Kraft was allegedly receiving certain sexual acts from masseuses, we ended up stumbling, as you said, across the owner, Cindy Yang. And Cindy Yang is interesting. She's a sort of serial entrepreneur, is how we think of her. And she came to the country from China back in 2003, ended up starting a series of day spas, one of which would become Orchids of Asia Day Spa, where Robert Kraft went, and sort of became an up-and-comer in South Florida through that scene. But one of the businesses that she pivoted to in recent years was a business of access peddling, essentially.
Now, let me just stop there. I just want to be clear. Was she at the time that Robert Kraft was allegedly inside doing something illicit, was she the owner of the spa, or had she sold the spa and was no longer the owner?
She was no longer the owner.
She was no longer the owner at that time.
At that time of that spa, no. She did own other spas. She owned a chain called Tokyo Day Spas. And so there were still about 3 of those spas in existence in Palm Beach and Broward counties at the time, but they were not part of the bust. They were not part of any of the allegations about sex trafficking.
So you stumble across her name as a former owner. Why do you continue to take interest? And what happens as you start digging around her profile on social media? When was that moment? Tell me about the moment when suddenly you look at her social media posts and you see pictures of her with Donald Trump.
Sure. So I think we were just looking to see if there was any possibility that this sting was going to extend into South Florida. And that was the reason for digging deeper and deeper into these business records. But I think just going through that exercise showed me that she had businesses beyond spa businesses. And one of them was a foundation, a women's charity foundation that never really filed any tax returns, didn't show up in 990s in the way that you would expect, and it turns out it had a Facebook page. When I clicked on that Facebook page, I saw Mar-a-Lago, and I saw Cindy Yang at Mar-a-Lago, so I kept on clicking. And that's when we saw Cindy Yang with Donald Trump watching the Super Bowl, watching the Patriots win the Super Bowl at Trump International Golf Course at the Grand Ballroom there this year.
And it turns out she's actually involved with lots of Republicans Republican. You start piecing together, she's a major Republican donor, has her picture taken with lots of individuals, correct?
That's right. I mean, in terms of major donor, we're not talking about millions of dollars. We're talking about tens of thousands that she sort of pieced together. But she's certainly a wheeler and dealer, and one of the things that she became very good at very quickly was getting people access to these famous high-profile Republican politicians so that they could take photos with them.
So, Jay, let me bring you in on this. So we've potentially got a couple of issues here. The first is more along the lines of, is she selling access? Is she promising to get people close to members of the Trump organization? Remember, this is like, we're talking about 2017, 2018, really, that time period. So Donald Trump is president by now. This doesn't predate him. So we're looking at potentially trying to pay for access into the inner circle of the Trump administration, but also potentially campaign finance violations. Pick up the story there.
Well, where it all becomes highly intriguing is when a woman by the name of Yu Zhang in late March shows up out of thin air at Mar-a-Lago and tries to connive her way in, succeeds getting past a Secret Service agent and eventually getting into Mar-a-Lago, but she's eventually stopped. And it turns out she gets arrested for trespassing. They charge her, and it looks like just a simple trespassing case. And that's when I sort of began to pay closer attention to the reporting that Sarah and Nick Nehamas and Caitlin Ostroff were doing. You know, they were doing a wonderful job of kind of showcasing Cindy Yang and all these, you know, kind of bizarre 6 degrees of separation from various Chinese leaders, businessmen, Chinese nationals here in the United States, the Trump campaign, Trump donors, and Mar-a-Lago. And it was like this universe of people. But when she shows up, it was like, what's going on here? What's she doing there? And at first, it looked like she was just another one of these people who was buying access to the president by attending an event at Mar-a-Lago. Well, then it turns out the event had been canceled. Then it turns out...
And it was Cindy Yang's event, supposedly.
Correct. And I should have made that clear, but it was Cindy Yang's event. And it was, you know, a gala event that had been canceled, but she came all the way to the United States and South Florida anyway and tried to get in. And so I started checking with my sources, and then I began to realize that there had been a counterintelligence investigation going on since late last year into all of these Chinese nationals that were coming to Mar-a-Lago. Now, I'm not suggesting they were all suspects in conducting espionage for the Chinese government, but South Florida FBI and South Florida, you know, counterintelligence and South Florida Federal U.S. Attorney's Office were focusing on these Chinese nationals coming to Mar-a-Lago.
Well, it makes sense that Mar-a-Lago was a potential target, a soft target in some ways, for access to the president. I remember those early days of the Trump administration. I think he had the Japanese prime minister here, and he's sitting out with a group of people out in the middle of everything, talking about, you know, plotting missions. And I think there was a raid on Syria. There was a bombing campaign on Syria. So the fact that ordinary people had sort of crossed paths with folks in power there at Mar-a-Lago made it a softer target than a lot of other places. You weren't going to walk into the White House the way you could walk into Mar-a-Lago.
Correct. And what also became apparent was this woman, Yu Zhang, was an educated Chinese woman, finance background. She spoke some English, and she was charged with lying to a federal agent and trespassing, but she had come in with a stash of money and a stash of electronics and supposedly malware. And so the suspicion was she was trying to gather information at Mar-a-Lago.
So when you say electronics, are we talking about like thumb drives, jump drives that could be, that potentially you plug it into one of the systems at Mar-a-Lago and then maybe see if it sort of works its way into something more sensitive?
Correct. Either to gather information or to spread misinformation. It's unclear which way it was supposedly intended to do.
Now, it's interesting. She's in federal court right now, and one of the things that you've picked up on, and both of you picked up on, is the fact that this case, you know, there are elements within the U.S. Attorney's Office that are trying to close part of it to the public because of the sensitive national security implications of some of this, which suggests this is ramping up in a big way.
Yes, it is. And they're not just looking at her. I mean, they had been looking at others in South Florida, businessmen that we're aware of, businessmen that have been identified in the stories that Sarah had done with her other colleagues. And it was apparent that there were access agents, we call them, coming here, perhaps trying to gather information about people at Mar-a-Lago or the president or his family or other people in South Florida. They were here possibly doing business deals, real estate deals, anything of that nature. But the focus on the classified information has more to do with Yujing Zhang and it's filed in her case. It's not a trespassing case anymore, but we won't know because the information that the U.S. Attorney's Office wants to file in the court record can't be shared with her under the Classified Information Protection Act.
So we've got this aspect of it going. Sarah, I want to come back to you. Obviously, the notion of buying access, we sort of jumped ahead to this counterintelligence part of it, but I mean, you are dealing with potentially campaign finance violations. There are issues surrounding whether or not campaign donations that were made to the Trump campaign may have been potentially reimbursed by others. Those allegations are being examined, correct?
That's right. I mean, there are a couple of issues here, right? One is, as you pointed out, that Mar-a-Lago is just an access point. So any event at Mar-a-Lago should be one where the guest list, you would think, should be scrutinized just because of who's coming into the quote-unquote winter White House. But there's also this secondary element, and that's when the event is a campaign fundraiser event, there are extra rules. And to make them sort of simple, anyone who doesn't hold a green card or is a U.S. citizen is not allowed to pay into a campaign event. They can attend as a guest, but they can't pay to be there. I
got to stop it there. It's fascinating stuff. You guys have been doing phenomenal work with your colleagues. I would encourage everyone to continue reading the Miami Herald, subscribe to the Miami Herald. All good stuff. All right, thank you both. When we come back, we will continue our look at Miami's forgotten workers at the airport.